Welcome, everyone, to the MindWire Podcast YouTube channel. We're incredibly thrilled to have you here today.
Really excited to get into this one.
Yeah, because whether you're tuning in on your commute right now, or maybe you're sitting at your desk trying to find some focus, or just out for a walk to clear your head, you are in for a truly transformative conversation today.
It's going to be a big one.
It really is. We are taking a massive stack of source material today. We're looking at clinical research, chronobiology, and the daily methodologies of some of the most highly effective people on the planet. And we are pulling out the absolute cognitive and behavioral architecture of high productivity.
And we should clarify right at the top.
Oh, absolutely. Let me be totally clear right out of the gate here. We are completely tearing down the old school hustle culture.
Yes.
That whole idea that you just need to grind harder, sleep less, push through the pain, we are tossing that right out the window. Instead, we are looking at hard neurobiology and system engineering to figure out how our brains actually work best.
It's such an essential shift in perspective. Because, for decades, the prevailing narrative in the corporate world has just been that productivity is purely a function of willpower.
Right. Like if you're not getting enough done, you're just lazy.
Exactly. The implication was always that you simply weren't trying hard enough, or you lacked discipline. But the rigorous scientific documents we're unpacking in this deep dive paint a vastly different picture.
A much more biological picture.
Right. We are going to look at the physiological limits of the human brain, the actual biology of how focus is generated, and how we can work with our neurochemistry rather than fighting against it every single day.
And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second. Consider this deep dive your own personalized masterclass. Maybe you're actively battling burnout right now, or you're feeling overwhelmed by a to-do list that just keeps regenerating no matter what you do. Or maybe you're just a high performer who wants to systematically optimize your day without completely crashing at the end of it. Our mission today is to help you build a sustainable, science-backed framework for your life that actually respects the biological limits of your own brain.
And to get there, we have a pretty fascinating roadmap ahead.
We really do. What exactly are we looking at in these sources to build this out?
So we're synthesizing several diverse fields of study today. We'll start by exploring the foundations of chronobiology, which is basically the science of our internal body clocks.
The Master Club.
Exactly. From there, we'll look at the metabolic ecosystem of the brain, essentially how we fuel our cognitive engine and why that dreaded afternoon crash happens.
Oh, we all know that crash.
Well, yeah. Then we'll dive into the neuroscience of focus, debate some of the most popular psychological frameworks for decision-making and prioritizing, and finally, look at the critical, often completely misunderstood role of rest, the brain's default mode network, and how to reconceptualize procrastination entirely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's dig right into that foundation, which is chronobiology. Because reading through these sources, the most glaring takeaway for me is just the absolute myth of the 9-to-5 workday.
It really is a myth.
It's wild to think that we still organize our entire society, our schools, our corporate structures completely around this monolithic industrial era schedule. We just expect everyone to be perfectly sharp and creative from exactly 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. But our biology actively fights that uniformity, doesn't it?
It does. It's a remarkable disconnect between societal structure and human physiology.
Yeah.
The concept of human productivity is deeply tied to our biological rhythms, specifically our circadian rhythm. And the mechanism controlling this is just fascinating. Deep inside the hypothalamus of your brain, there is a cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN.
I always try to picture these anatomical structures. How big are we talking when we say a cluster of neurons?
Minuscule. We are talking about roughly 0.25 cubic millimeters per nucleus.
Wow. That is tiny.
It's incredibly small, yet this tiny structure is the absolute master clock of your entire body. It dictates the rhythm of your day by constantly scanning the environment for external cues.
Like sunlight.
Right. Chronobiologists call these cues Zeitgebers, which is a German term that literally translates to time givers. The most powerful of these are light exposure and the timing of your food intake. So the SCN takes these environmental signals and uses them to orchestrate the peripheral clocks located in virtually every single tissue and organ in your body.
So it's essentially taking the sunlight hitting my eyes and using that to tell my liver and my heart what time it is so the whole system is synced up.
That's a great way to conceptualize it. And the primary chemical messenger this clock uses to communicate with the rest of the body is cortisol.
Cortisol gets a bad rap.
It really does. It's a glucocorticoid hormone that is frequently demonized in popular media as just the stress hormone that makes you hold on to belly fat or feel anxious.
Hmm.
But it is fundamentally essential for life and alertness.
You literally wouldn't wake up without it.
Exactly. The SCN controls a very pronounced diurnal curve of cortisol secretion. In a healthy system, your cortisol levels surge in the early morning. This is the physiological trigger that naturally wakes you up. It promotes vigilance, sharpens your cognition, and prepares your metabolism for action.
And then it drops off.
Right. As the day progresses, this cortisol level slowly and inexorably declines, eventually making way for melatonin in the evening to prepare the body for rest.
Which really explains why expecting someone to have a breakthrough strategic epiphany at 4:30 in the afternoon is usually a losing battle.
Usually, yes.
The biological alertness has just already left the building.
For a large portion of the population, that's entirely true. When we try to force high-level cognitive output during a natural cortisol trough, we're essentially running the engine without oil. Furthermore, any chronic disruption to this natural curve.
Like shift work or staring at your phone in bed.
Exactly. Things like shift work or staring at the blue light of a screen late into the night, it causes severe dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Okay, wait, that is a dense piece of anatomy. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, what is actually happening in my body when that dysregulates?
Think of it as the body's primary stress response system, just breaking down. When it dysregulates, your brain stops getting the correct signals about when to be alert and when to recover.
So you're just wired and tired at the same time.
Exactly. Your baseline concentration drops, your emotional regulation suffers, and structurally, you drastically increase your risk for metabolic and cardiovascular diseases. The highly productive people analyzed in our sources, they don't fight their natural cortisol curve. They architect their complex work right around it.
And this is where I want to talk about how this applies to you listening right now, because we all have this master clock, but it turns out our clocks are not set to the exact same time zone at all.
Not even close.
The sources detail 4 specific chronotypes. And as we walk through these, I highly encourage you to try and self-diagnose. Think about which one sounds like you. Let's start with the classic early bird, the lions.
Right, the lions. This categorization comes from a clinical sleep psychologist named Dr. Michael Brewis. The lion makes up about 15 to 20% of the population.
Okay.
Lions are your quintessential early risers. They wake up naturally, often before dawn, and they experience a massive immediate surge of energy in the first half of the day.
Must be nice.
It is for them. They're biologically primed for tackling complex analytical problems first thing. For a lion, their absolute peak window for deep work, which we'll define later as highly demanding cognitive tasks, is strictly between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m.
But there's a serious trade-off for that morning superpower, right? I mean, the afternoon crash for a lion must be pretty severe.
It's an inevitable biological reality. By the time noon rolls around, a lion's energy begins a steep decline. The window between 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. should ideally be reserved for light recovery, administrative tasks, or routine meetings that don't require heavy lifting.
So asking a lion to make a critical, high-stakes decision at 4 p.m. is just asking for impaired judgment.
Absolutely.
Now let's move to the majority of the population, the bears.
Yes, the bear encompasses about 50 to 55% of people. Their internal clock is very closely tied to the natural solar cycle.
So they wake up with the sun.
Exactly. And their energy builds more gradually than the lion. Their peak deep work window is shifted slightly later, typically between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. After 2 p.m., their energy tapers off throughout the afternoon.
Which makes sense why the 9 to 5 was built.
Right, because they represent the majority. Traditional corporate society is largely structured around the bear's rhythm, which makes their professional lives somewhat frictionless compared to the other types.
But then we have the night owls, the wolves. And looking at the data here, it seems like society is incredibly unfair to this group.
It is a profound structural disadvantage. The wolf represents another 15 to 20% of the population, and their circadian rhythm is significantly delayed.
So waking up early isn't just annoying for them?
No, it is physiologically deeply uncomfortable. Their brains are simply not fully online at 7 a.m. However, their peak for analytical and creative productivity surges late in the day, often into the night. Their optimal deep work window usually falls between 5 p.m. and midnight.
I want to pause on that because it's so important. Think about a wolf who has a corporate job that mandates an 8 a.m. strategic brainstorming session.
It's a disaster.
You are essentially asking them to perform high-level cognitive work while their neurochemistry is screaming at them to be asleep. But let me throw a hypothetical at you. What if I am a wolf chronotype, but I have a toddler who wakes up at 6 a.m. every single day? How does biology handle that kind of unavoidable friction?
That is where biological predisposition collides with environmental reality. In that scenario, the wolf is going to experience chronic social jet lag.
Social jet lag.
Right. They are forced to operate on a bear or lion schedule, which means their cortisol and melatonin secretion are constantly mismatched with their required activities. They will likely rely heavily on chemical stimulants like caffeine to force alertness in the morning.
Which then ruins their sleep later.
Exactly. It disrupts their natural ability to sleep when their body finally wants to wind down. For a wolf in that situation, the strategy isn't to perfectly align with their chronotype because they literally can't, but to fiercely protect a small window of evening time for their most complex thinking and just give themselves grace for being slower in the mornings.
It's about mitigation rather than perfection.
Right.
Finally, we have the dolphins. This one always sounds a bit intense.
The dolphin makes up about 10% of the population. In nature, real dolphins sleep with only half their brain at a time to stay alert for predators.
Which is wild.
It is. And human dolphins share a similar trait of light, highly fragmented sleep. They often struggle with insomnia, sensitivity to noise, or nighttime anxiety. Their energy fluctuates unpredictably throughout the day.
But they're often highly intelligent, right?
Yes, they frequently have these sudden, unpredictable sparks of creativity. Their most reliable window for focus is quite narrow, usually from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., with recovery tasks best suited for the afternoon.
So figuring out your chronotype is a great starting point. But the sources go a step further. There's a methodology to chart your own personal energy called biological prime time, or BPT, developed by Sam Carpenter. But reading through the protocol and the sources...
It sounds agonizing.
It really does.
It is a rigorous clinical self-experiment, and it does require a high tolerance for temporary discomfort. The premise is that it's not enough to just know you generally fit the profile of a bear or a wolf. You need to empirically map your specific minute-by-minute energy levels.
Okay, so how do you do it?
Carpenter recommends an observation period of 21 consecutive days where you record your energy, focus, and motivation every single hour.
And the catch is that you can't just do this while living your normal life. You have to eliminate all the artificial variables.
Exactly. To isolate your true endogenous rhythms, meaning your internal, unadulterated biological timing, you must remove the confounding variables. That means absolutely zero caffeine, zero alcohol. And you cannot use an artificial alarm clock.
No alarm clock for 3 weeks.
For 3 weeks. You have to allow your body to wake up and fall asleep entirely naturally.
I can hear people listening to this and immediately panicking at the thought of no coffee for 21 days, let alone not using an alarm clock if they have a job to get to. The friction of actually executing that experiment is huge. How does anyone actually survive the withdrawal phase of that?
Well, the first 3 to 5 days are notoriously difficult. You will likely experience headaches, lethargy, and a severe drop in perceived productivity. But once the adenosine receptors in your brain reset from the lack of caffeine, clear, undeniable biological patterns start to emerge.
And you find your real baseline.
Yes, not only will you discover your macro-circadian rhythms, but you will also uncover your ultradian rhythms.
Ultradian rhythms. I love this concept. It's essentially the battery life of human attention, right?
That's a very accurate analogy. While circadian rhythms operate on a 24-hour cycle, ultradian rhythms are shorter physiological cycles occurring within that day, typically lasting 90 to 120 minutes.
So an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Right. During an ultradian cycle, you experience a cognitive warm-up, followed by a peak of intense productivity, and then a natural biological decline in attention that demands a period of recovery.
And what happens if you sync up with that?
The clinical data suggests that organizing your complex work to harmonize with these 90 to 120-minute cycles can boost performance by up to 40%.
40% is massive.
It is. Conversely, trying to force maximum concentration during a natural energetic trough rapidly exhausts the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, so if the internal clock is the engine timing, what is happening with the fuel we are putting into it? Because that brings us to the metabolic ecosystem of the brain. I want to highlight a really striking fact from the sources. Your brain makes up only about 2% of your total body weight.
Right.
But it burns up to 20% of your total energy. It is an absolute glucose-guzzling machine.
It is the most metabolically expensive organ in the human body. And this means productivity is not just a psychological phenomenon where you just try to think harder. It is inextricably linked to cellular metabolism.
So what I eat directly dictates how I think.
Absolutely. Every email you write, every complex problem you solve requires physical fuel. And the specific nature of the food you consume has a direct, immediate, and measurable impact on your cognitive stability.
Let's talk about the dreaded afternoon crash, because everyone knows this feeling. It's 3 p.m., you feel like you've walked into a mental brick wall, and you just want to crawl under your desk. But let me ask you this. What if I'm eating what I think is a healthy snack? Let's say I have a fruit smoothie or a granola bar at 2 p.m. Why am I still crashing an hour later? Dr. Ron Friedman's research and the sources really sheds light on this.
You're touching on a very common misconception here. Dr. Friedman's work highlights how the body converts almost everything we eat into glucose, which is the primary fuel for the brain. However, the kinetics of how that glucose enters your bloodstream varies wildly depending on the macronutrients.
Okay.
Many so-called healthy snacks, like a standard granola bar or a fruit smoothie, are actually packed with simple, refined carbohydrates and sugars. When you consume them, you trigger a rapid, massive release of glucose into your blood.
It's like throwing a bucket of gasoline on a small fire. You get this huge, bright flare-up of energy.
But the body recognizes that sudden hyperglycemia, that massive spike in blood sugar, as a dangerous physiological imbalance. So the pancreas responds by releasing a massive surge of insulin to pull that glucose out of the blood and store it in your cells.
And that's where it all goes wrong.
Right, because the problem is this insulin response is often an overcorrection. It pulls out too much, too fast, which leads to reactive hypoglycemia.
And that reactive hypoglycemia is the 3 p.m. brain fog.
Precisely. Your brain is suddenly starved of its primary fuel source. You experience intense lethargy, irritability, and cognitive impairment. Highly productive individuals recognize this mechanism.
So they eat differently.
They don't view food merely as calories. They view it as a tool for glycemic management. They prioritize high-quality proteins, healthy lipids, and complex carbohydrates with a low glycemic index, like leafy greens or nuts.
To keep the fire burning slowly.
Exactly, to ensure a slow, steady, prolonged release of cognitive fuel, avoiding the spike and the subsequent crash entirely.
And food is only one part of that metabolic ecosystem. The sources also heavily emphasize movement. We sit at desks all day, effectively ignoring our bodies from the neck down just so we can focus on our screens. But movement is basically cognitive armor, isn't it? What is physically happening in the brain when we exercise?
Regular physical exercise triggers the process called neurogenesis, which is the creation of new neurons. This happens profoundly in the hippocampus, which is the brain region critical for learning and memory consolidation. Furthermore, exercise promotes the release of BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I've heard BDNF described as miracle grow for the brain.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. BDNF is a crucial protein that ensures the survival of existing neurons and encourages synaptic plasticity,
Which means?
which is the physical mechanism of how our brain adapts and learns new information. A lack of movement literally starves the brain of these regenerative processes.
The sources highlight a specific, highly relevant study conducted in Algeria during the COVID-19 pandemic to illustrate just how fragile this balance really is. They looked at 290 adults during the confinements. And it paints a pretty bleak picture of knowledge work.
It does. The researchers found that 45% of these individuals were working more than 5 hours a day strictly on screens. The sudden shift to remote work removed all incidental movement. No walking to the train, no walking across the office to a meeting.
You just go from the bed to the desk.
Right. This prolonged, intense intellectual work, coupled with confinement, led to a massive spike in sedentary behavior.
And the physical toll was rapid. 21% of the sample became overweight alongside major negative changes in their dietary habits. Because, when the pantry is 10 feet away from your laptop, the friction to snack constantly just disappears.
The takeaway from that study isn't just about weight gain, though. It's about the cognitive fallout of that lifestyle. The extreme sedentariness induced by modern knowledge work must be actively counterbalanced.
So exercise isn't just about looking good.
Not at all. Planned exercise isn't just for physical aesthetics or cardiovascular health. It acts as a necessary physiological intervention to evacuate accumulated stress hormones and restore your sheer capacity for focused attention.
Which leads us to the final and arguably most abused pillar of this metabolic ecosystem: sleep. I want to be incredibly clear about something based on our sources. The idea that highly successful people sleep 4 hours a night and just outwork their competitors who are resting that is a toxic myth. It is pure biological fiction. What happens if I try to just catch up on sleep over the weekend?
You cannot truly bank sleep or pay off a severe sleep debt over a single weekend. The clinical consensus is absolute. Optimal human cognitive performance requires 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. We have to stop viewing sleep as a passive state of doing nothing. It is a highly active biological process.
It's when the brain is doing its heavy lifting.
Yes, it is when the brain consolidates memory, transferring what you learned during the day from short-term to long-term storage.
And beyond memory, the sources detail a literal physical cleaning process that happens in the brain. The glymphatic system. How does that work?
The glymphatic system is one of the most vital discoveries in recent sleep science. During deep, slow-wave sleep, the glial cells in your brain actually shrink slightly.
The cells themselves get smaller.
Right. This opens up the interstitial spaces, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to rush through the brain tissue. This fluid literally washes away the neurotoxins and metabolic waste products, particularly a protein called amyloid beta that accumulates in the brain during waking hours as a byproduct of thinking.
So if you cut your sleep short, you are interrupting the washing cycle. You wake up with a brain that is literally swimming in metabolic toxic waste.
That is the biological reality.
Yeah.
And the cognitive deficits of that state are severe. Chronic sleep deprivation mimics the cognitive impairment of clinical alcohol intoxication. Your reaction times, your emotional regulation, and your analytical skills plummet. That is why truly productive individuals systemize rigorous sleep hygiene. Sleep is the ultimate, non-negotiable foundation of all cognitive output.
Okay, so we have the biological foundation, we have the internal clock, and we have the fuel. Now we have to figure out how to direct that energy. Because once your brain is fueled and rested, you have to focus it. And in our modern world, attention is the rarest commodity. This brings us to Cal Newport's revolutionary concept of deep work versus shallow work. How does he define deep work?
Newport defines deep work as the ability to focus intensely for a prolonged period without a single distraction on a cognitively demanding task. You're pushing your intellectual capabilities to their absolute physiological limits.
Which is incredibly hard to do right now.
Exactly. In a knowledge economy that is completely saturated with notifications, Slack messages, and constant interruptions, this ability has become incredibly rare, and therefore it is disproportionately valued by the market.
And this is where the neurobiology gets fascinating again. Because deep work isn't just a good habit or a productivity hack. It actually causes a physical structural change in the brain. We are talking about myelination. What is myelin?
When you engage in disciplined, highly focused deep work, you stimulate the formation of a substance called myelin in the white matter of your brain. Myelin is a fatty layer that wraps around the axons of your neurons.
I always picture this like wrapping electrical tape around a frayed copper wire. If the wire is bare, the signal leaks out and travels slowly. But if you wrap it in thick tape, the signal moves perfectly.
That is exactly how it functions. It acts as an electrical insulator. When a neural pathway is heavily myelinated from repeated, deep focus, the electrical signals jump down the axon much faster, much more synchronously, and with vastly greater efficiency.
It's literally upgrading your hardware.
Yes. This physical optimization, this thickening of the myelin sheath, is the literal biological foundation of acquiring expertise and increasing your intellectual processing speed.
Which means the inverse is also true. Every time you check your phone while trying to write a complex report, you are physically interrupting that myelination process. You are actively choosing to keep your brain slower and less efficient.
You are sabotaging your own neural architecture. The constant barrage of digital notifications and multitasking is what Newport calls shallow work. Constant interruptions completely prevent myelination. Furthermore, shifting your attention back and forth between tasks incurs a massive metabolic tax known as context switching.
Context switching. It's like turning a car engine off and on again every 50 feet while driving down the highway. It burns through your fuel and ruins the engine.
Yes. The brain has to load the complex rules for task A, then dump them to load the rules for task B, and then dump them again to go back to task A. It fragments attention and induces severe cognitive fatigue. High performers guard their deep work windows ferociously.
They protect that time.
They block out 1 to 4 uninterrupted hours, usually in their biological prime time, where all external stimuli are systematically blocked.
But knowing we should focus and actually doing it are two very different things because our brains are naturally biased toward novelty. We want the dopamine hit of checking the shiny new notification. The sources detail several tactical execution systems to essentially trick our biased brains into focusing. Let's walk through these frameworks and talk about where they work and, honestly, where they fall apart. Let's start with the Pomodoro technique.
The Pomodoro technique, invented by Francesco Cirillo, is highly effective for maintaining vigilance on tedious tasks. It involves hyper-focused work intervals of 25 minutes, followed by a mandatory 5-minute pause. After 4 complete cycles, you take a longer 15 to 30-minute break.
And neurologically, why does that work?
Neurologically, this is brilliant because it prevents decision fatigue in the prefrontal cortex and leverages the brain's love of novelty through rhythm.
But where does it fail? Because I've tried Pomodoro for creative writing, and it can be infuriating to have an alarm go off right when I finally hit a state of flow.
That is the exact friction point. Pomodoro is excellent for administrative tasks, studying flashcards or clearing an inbox. Tasks that require vigilance, but not necessarily deep creative immersion.
Right.
If you use a strict 25-minute timer for a task that requires an hour just to load the context into your working memory, like complex coding or writing, the timer becomes an artificial interruption. For those tasks, you need longer blocks.
Which brings us to time boxing, or time blocking.
This is a favorite among CEOs. Instead of operating from an endless, ambiguous to-do list, you allocate strict, defined blocks of time in your visual calendar for specific categories of tasks. From 9 to 11 a.m., you are only writing. From 11 to 11:30 a.m., you are only checking email.
It completely eliminates the cognitive cost of constantly deciding, what should I do next? But the friction here is that humans are terrible at estimating how long things take. We always think a project will take an hour, and it takes 3.
That's known as the planning fallacy. The key to successful time boxing is building in buffer zones. If you think a task takes an hour, block an hour and a half. The goal isn't to create a rigid prison for yourself. It's to structurally protect your periods of deep work by making them immovable appointments, just like a doctor's visit.
Let's look at David Allen's famous system, Getting Things Done, or GTD. The core of this system ties into a psychological phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. What is happening in our brains there?
The Zeigarnik effect is a fundamental psychological principle. It states that our brains are hardwired to obsess over unfinished or interrupted tasks. Have you ever woken up at 3 a.m. in a panic because you suddenly remembered you forgot to send a crucial email?
Oh, absolutely. All the time.
That is the Zeigarnik effect in action. If you try to hold a mental list of things you need to do, those tasks remain prominent in your working memory, constantly demanding attention and generating background anxiety.
So how does GTD actually solve that?
GTD demands the immediate, exhaustive capture of all ideas, commitments, and tasks into an external, reliable system, like a physical notebook or a digital app. The moment a thought enters your head, you write it down and categorize it.
Just get it out of your head.
By externalizing it, you short-circuit the Zeigarnik effect. You signal to your brain that the information is safe and will be dealt with, allowing your working memory to release the anxiety and focus entirely on execution.
You're closing the open tabs in your brain's browser so the computer stops crashing. I love that. Okay, what about Eat That Frog? It sounds terrible, but it's a classic for a reason.
Inspired by a Mark Twain quote and popularized by Brian Tracy, Eat That Frog mandates that you tackle your most complex, arduous, or unpleasant task first thing in the morning. Why? Because you are riding the crest of that warning cortisol peak, and your reserve of willpower is fully intact.
And there's a chemical reward for doing it, right?
Yes. Completing that massive, difficult task generates a profound dopaminergic surge, a huge hit of dopamine. This creates psychological momentum, making all subsequent, lesser tasks throughout the day feel effortless by comparison.
But what if the frog is just too big and scary? What if the task is so overwhelming that you just stare at it and physically can't start? That's where the Swiss cheese method comes in, theorized by Alan Lekine.
Right, because when a project is massive and intimidating, the brain's amygdala, which is the fear center, can trigger a literal paralysis response. The Swiss cheese method bypasses the amygdala by poking tiny holes in the project. You fragment the massive task into incredibly tiny, almost ridiculously easy microtasks with very short time limits.
So instead of write the 50-page annual report, the task becomes open a Word document and type the title.
Exactly. It drastically lowers the psychological barrier to entry. It bypasses the fear response, allowing you to initiate movement. And in productivity, initiating the movement is often 90% of the battle. Once you start, momentum usually takes over.
So we have all these systems to execute, but how do we know we are executing the right things? Because even with the best systems, you still have too much to do. How do you separate the noise from the signal?
That is the critical skill of the high performer. Without a conceptual framework for filtering information, you will simply become very efficient at doing things that don't matter. The most robust tool for strategic prioritization in our sources is the Eisenhower matrix, popularized by Stephen Covey.
Let's break down the matrix. It divides everything on your plate into 4 quadrants based on 2 axes. Importance, meaning, does this serve my long-term goals? And urgency, meaning, does this demand immediate attention right now? Walk us through quadrant 1.
Quadrant 1 contains tasks that are both urgent and important. These are the crises, the pressing problems, the immediate hard deadlines. Acting on these is mandatory. However, if you live entirely in Quadrant 1, your sympathetic nervous system is trapped in a chronic fight-or-flight state. A structural overload here is usually a clinical symptom of poor planning or a failure to delegate. You survive the day, but you are running on pure adrenaline.
It's putting out fires all day, you don't build anything, you just try not to burn down. Then there is the Holy Grail, Quadrant 2.
Quadrant 2 is important, but not urgent. This is the golden zone of high productivity. It encompasses strategic thinking, long-term planning, relationship building, skill training, and crisis prevention. Highly effective leaders invest the vast majority of their time here.
Because it's not on fire yet.
Right. Because these tasks are not urgent, you can approach them in a calm, rational, proactive neurological state. And the magic of Quadrant 2 is that the more time you spend here planning and preventing, the fewer fires emerge in Quadrant 1.
But we all fall into the trap of Quadrant 3. Let's talk about why Q3 is so dangerous.
Quadrant 3 is urgent, but not important. This is the absolute trap of false productivity. It's the constant interruptions, the minor requests from colleagues, the endless flow of irrelevant emails that ding on your phone.
Yeah.
It feels urgent because it's right in front of you, demanding a response.
And it tricks us because we get a dopamine hit from doing it.
That is the illusion. Completing these minor tasks gives you a quick hit of dopamine, creating the illusion of accomplishment. But you are sacrificing your high-value Q2 projects to do it. Tasks in Quadrant 3 must be ruthlessly delegated or automated. An inability to let go of Q3 tasks usually points to a psychological need for control or a fear of saying no.
And lastly, Quadrant 4. Not urgent, not important.
This is pure time wasting. Doom scrolling on social media, meetings without agendas, digital procrastination. These activities offer zero value, drain your cognitive bandwidth, and must be completely eliminated.
The Eisenhower matrix forces your prefrontal cortex to override our natural human bias, which always favors the immediate, urgent reward over long-term strategic building. But the sources mention a couple of other complementary frameworks to help filter the noise. What is the Moscow method?
Moscow is an acronym originating from Agile project management used to combat scope creep, which is when a project endlessly expands beyond its original parameters. It forces teams to categorize elements into 4 firm buckets: must have, should have, could have, and won't have.
The won't have bucket seems really important.
The won't have is particularly powerful because it explicitly defines what you are choosing not to do, which brings instant clarity to bloated projects.
And of course, there's the Pareto principle.
The 80-20 rule. The observation by economist Vilfredo Pareto that 80% of your results typically stem from just 20% of your efforts. High performers constantly audit their time to identify that crucial 20% high-leverage activity, and they restructure or eliminate the rest to maximize the return on their cognitive capital.
So we know how to filter tasks and how to execute them, but what are we aiming at? Structuring your time is pointless if you don't have a clear destination. Let's look at the synergy of goal setting. The foundational tool here is the SMART goal.
Introduced in 1981, the SMART framework is the gold standard for tactical execution. A goal must be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound.
The psychology behind the time-bound and measurable parts is really interesting to me. Why is a deadline so neurologically important?
A strict deadline acts as a structural constraint against Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law dictates that work will inevitably expand to fill the time allotted for its completion.
Right. If you have a week, it takes a week.
Exactly. If you give yourself a month to write a proposal, you will overthink it, tinker with it, and it will take a month. If you give yourself 2 days, you will execute it in 2 days. A deadline provides necessary structuring pressure. Additionally, the measurable aspect allows you to track progress. Every time you cross off a measurable milestone, your brain releases dopamine, which sustains your intrinsic motivation over long periods.
But I want to challenge the R in SMART. Realistic. If we only ever aim for what we know is realistically attainable, aren't we just guaranteeing mediocrity? How do we ever achieve anything groundbreaking if we are forced to be realistic?
You are identifying the exact limitation of the SMART framework. It is excellent for maintaining operations, but it does not foster paradigm shifts. That is why visionary leaders and highly innovative tech companies utilize a parallel system, OKRs, or objectives and key results.
How do those differ?
OKRs separate the aspiration from the measurement. The objective is qualitative. It is a deeply ambitious, inspiring, overarching destination. Something like revolutionize the user experience in our sector.
And the key results are the quantitative metrics that prove you are getting there. But the secret sauce of OKRs is this idea of the stretch goal, or a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. The sources say that when setting an OKR, you should intentionally aim for a target where your probability of success is realistically only about 70%. So you are basically planning to fail 30% of the time. Why would you engineer a system like that?
Because of the psychological shift it forces. Let's use an example. If I am your manager and I ask you to improve your sales numbers by 10% this year, what will you do?
I'll probably just make a few more calls, work a little harder at what I'm already doing.
Exactly. You'll work a little bit harder using your exact same methods. But if I demand that you improve sales by 500% with only a 70% chance of hitting it, your existing incremental methods are mathematically insufficient. You cannot just make more phone calls.
You have to break the system to fix it.
You are forced to abandon comfort, blow up your current processes, and invent a completely new distribution model, aiming for the impossible force's radical innovation.
But I have to imagine that deploying massive, scary OKRs where failure is mathematically probable sounds incredibly stressful for a team.
And that is the crucial caveat the sources explicitly warn about. You cannot deploy stretch goals in a corporate environment that lacks psychological safety. If an organization punishes failure, giving an employee a goal with a built-in 30% chance of failure is cruel.
It's just a recipe for burnout.
It breeds chronic anxiety, performance paralysis, and toxic productivity. The healthiest organizations use OKRs at the macro, leadership level to drive vision and innovation, but they use SMART goals at the micro, daily level to ensure disciplined, manageable execution for their teams without burning them out.
We've spent a lot of time talking about pushing the brain, focusing the brain, and setting massive goals to stretch the brain. But now we arrive at what might be the most paradigm-shifting part of this entire deep dive, the psychology of rest. We really have to challenge the core tenet of hustle culture right now, the ingrained idea that doing nothing is a waste of time.
Contemporary neurocognitive science categorically refutes the idea that exceptional performance requires an uninterrupted grind. Strategic rest, cognitive detachment, and mental wandering are not a waste of time. They are the physiological engines of insight, complex problem-solving, and innovation.
And this all comes down to a specific circuit in the brain called the default mode network, or DMN.
Okay.
What exactly is this network?
The discovery of the DMN revolutionized cognitive neuroscience. For a long time, we thought the brain simply powered down when we stopped working, but neuroimaging showed the opposite. When you stop focusing on an external, goal-directed task, when you stop writing the email, close the spreadsheet, and just stare out the window, your brain does not shut down.
It actually turns on.
Instead, the default mode network lights up and becomes massively metabolically active.
And the data on how often this happens is wild. The sources note that the human mind naturally wanders for about 46.9% of our waking hours. Almost half of our lives are spent not focusing on the present moment.
It's an immense amount of time. Now, if you are trying to execute a specific dangerous task, like driving a car or doing surgery, this mind wandering is a hindrance. But when activated intentionally through restorative activities, like taking a walk in nature without your phone, meditating, or simply sitting on a park bench, the DMN becomes the absolute neurological cradle of creativity.
So what is the DMN actually doing while we're supposedly doing nothing?
It is engaging in divergent thinking. It is consolidating episodic memories, projecting future scenarios, and most importantly, it is subconsciously linking disparate concepts. It processes all the background information you fed it to generate epiphanies.
This is why ideas happen in the shower.
This is the exact scientific process of creative incubation. You cannot force a brilliant, innovative idea by simply staring harder at a blank piece of paper. The idea suddenly comes to you in the shower or while you're washing the dishes because the DMN has finally been allowed the bandwidth to connect the dots.
Which means rest is a necessity, not a reward. What happens to the brain if we ignore this and just stay constantly stimulated with podcasts, emails, and work?
Clinical research correlates clinical burnout directly with a measurable decrease in the functional connectivity of the default mode network. If you treat inaction as a threat and stay constantly stimulated, you mechanically suppress the DMN. Your brain's structural integrity suffers, and you lose your capacity for novel thought.
This makes so much sense of why high performers do things that seem counterproductive to hustle culture. Bill Gates famously takes think weeks. Total isolation in a cabin, no operational emergencies, no emails, just reading and thinking to let the DMN trigger strategic breakthroughs. Or Maya Angelou, who viewed creative energy not as a finite resource you drain through work, but something you actively regenerate through deliberate deceleration. If you want to perform at the highest possible level, you have to institutionalize empty time into your calendar.
That is the hallmark of the elite performer. They understand that rest is not what you do after the work is done. Rest is a fundamental, integrated component of the work itself.
So speaking of deceleration, let's talk about something we all do when we are supposed to be working: procrastination. I want you to think about your own habits right now. When you put off a task, is it always a failure of willpower? Are you just being lazy? Because the sources reconceptualize this entirely.
The idea that all procrastination is a pathological failure of discipline is one of the most persistent psychological myths we face. Modern psychometrics and differential psychology have evolved past that. We now draw a hard, empirical line between two very distinct forms of procrastination: passive and active.
Let's start with passive procrastination because this is the one we are all painfully familiar with, the one that makes us feel terrible.
Passive procrastination is an irrational, involuntary avoidance of a task. It is deeply correlated with neuroticism and emotional instability. It is driven by paralyzing anxiety, crippling perfectionism, self-doubt, or an intense fear of failure. The individual deeply wants to act, but they are a victim of their own emotional indecision.
And the downstream results are exactly what you'd expect: poor performance, chronic stress, and a lingering sense of guilt that ruins whatever activity you were doing instead of working. But then there is active procrastination. How can delaying a task actually be a strategic choice?
Active procrastination is a deliberate, intentional decision to delay an action. It is frequently seen in extroverted individuals who possess high stress resilience. They intentionally use the adrenaline generated by an impending deadline as a physiological catalyst.
They need the pressure.
They know from past experience that extreme time pressure sharpens their mental focus, triggering a state of flow or hyperfocus that they simply cannot muster without the adrenaline of the looming deadline. They need the pressure cooker to cook.
And there's a really fascinating subbehavior here called productive procrastination. I am entirely guilty of this. This is when I am terrified of writing a difficult chapter of projects, so instead I frantically organize my entire pantry, clean my inbox to zero, and do my taxes. I'm avoiding the main thing, but I'm being fiercely productive in the background.
You are illustrating a highly common coping mechanism among capable individuals. You feel anxiety about the primary task, but instead of succumbing to passive paralysis like binge-watching television, you redirect that nervous energy into highly useful secondary tasks. The key differentiator for high performers here is metacognitive awareness.
Meaning they know they're playing a trick on themselves.
Exactly. They're lucid enough to recognize why they are delaying. If they realize they're engaging in active procrastination, they trust their process and ride the adrenaline later. But if they identify that they're falling into passive, anxiety-driven paralysis, they don't just wait for motivation to strike.
They force it.
They immediately deploy the rigid structures we discussed earlier, like the Pomodoro technique or the Swiss cheese method, to artificially force the initiation of the task. They understand the neuroscience. In states of anxiety, motivation follows action, not the other way around.
It requires deep self-awareness to know which state you are in. And managing those states leads us to our final major area of discussion: transition rituals and the danger of toxic productivity. Because how we start the day, how we end it, and how we draw boundaries determines if any of this is sustainable. Let's look at the morning first.
The architecture of the first few minutes after you wake up disproportionately dictates the metabolic and emotional trajectory of your entire day. The goal of a morning ritual is not necessarily to execute a massive amount of work immediately. It is to absolutely eradicate decision fatigue.
The sources share this brilliant anecdote about the legendary American choreographer Twyla Tharp. Her morning ritual is famous, but the ritual isn't the actual 2-hour grueling workout she does at the gym. Her ritual is simply getting in the taxi at 5:30 in the morning.
That is a masterclass in what psychologists call behavioral anchoring. The only decision Tharp has to make when she wakes up is to put on her clothes and tell the taxi driver the address of the gym. Once that singular initiating action is executed, the entire sequence of the morning becomes automated.
It's a domino effect. She doesn't have to negotiate with herself.
Precisely.
Mm.
By removing the internal negotiation, should I work out, should I sleep 10 more minutes, is it raining? She preserves the finite resource of her willpower, her volitional energy, for the high-level cognitive tasks of choreographing later in the day. Establishing an immutable morning sequence acts as cognitive preconditioning. It anchors you in a state of proactive control before the external world can impose its emergencies upon you.
So the start of the day is automated, but what about the end? Because especially now, with the prevalence of remote work, the physical boundaries between the office and the living room have been completely obliterated. When your laptop is literally on your kitchen table, how do you actually stop working?
The procedure for cognitive disconnection is arguably more important than the morning start. If you do not deliberately transition your brain from the intense, problem-solving beta wave state to a parasympathetic resting state, you cannot activate the default mode network. You cannot recover.
And you fall back into the Zeigarnik effect.
Exactly. In the absence of a physical boundary, like a train commute home, the brain falls victim to the Zeigarnik effect we discussed. The unfinished tasks will torment your working memory, causing background anxiety that ruins your evening and your sleep.
To defeat this, Cal Newport codified a specific 10 to 15-minute shutdown ritual, and I think the friction of actually doing this every day is worth exploring. It has 3 strict steps.
Step 1 is consolidation. You comprehensively gather every stray note on your desk, every unread email requiring action, and every idea scribbled down during the day, and you transfer them into your trusted external task management system. Step 2 is planning. You review your calendar for the next 2 weeks to anticipate bottlenecks, and you define your primary target, your frog, for the next morning.
And step 3 is the part that sounds a little crazy, but it's neurologically brilliant, the magic phrase.
Yes, you physically close your computer and state out loud an immutable phrase of closure. Newport uses schedule shutdown complete.
Why out loud? Why do I have to talk to myself in an empty room?
Because vocalization serves as a sealed psychological contract with yourself. Let's say it's 10 p.m., and an intrusive thought about a work project pops into your head. If you haven't done the ritual, you will engage with that worry and start problem-solving in bed.
But if you said the phrase...
But if you've spoken the phrase, you use metacognition. You tell yourself, I said the shutdown phrase. I would never have said the phrase if I hadn't meticulously checked my systems and secured my deadlines. This simple, logical reminder instantly deactivates the amygdala's stress response, banishing the intrusive thought and allowing authentic cognitive disconnection.
That is powerful. It builds a psychological wall, and it paves the way for what the sources call evening architecture. We are trying to deliberately transition our brainwaves from active beta down to relaxed alpha and finally into the theta waves of early sleep. What are the biological tactics for this?
First, read non-work-related books or engage in hobbies. This stimulates cross-disciplinary neuroplasticity without inducing performance stress. Second, you must aggressively stop exposure to blue light from screens at least 1 to 2 hours before bed. Blue light directly inhibits the pineal gland's secretion of melatonin, the hormone that signals the body to induce sleep.
But what if you do all that and your mind is still racing and you physically feel tense? How do you hit the brakes?
That is when you deploy physiological interventions, like the 4-7-8 breathing method. You inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 7, and exhale slowly for 8. This acts as a natural pharmacological intervention. It forces the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, slowing your heart rate and dropping your blood pressure to precipitate sleep. Finally, the sources highly recommend gratitude journaling to finish the day.
I'll admit, gratitude journaling always sounded a bit soft to me compared to all this hard neurobiology, but there is actual science behind why it works, right?
There is profound science behind it. The human brain has an evolutionary negativity bias. We are biologically wired to remember threats, failures, and anxieties to ensure our survival. Deliberately writing down things you are grateful for physically rewires neural pathways over time, orienting the brain toward a positive perception. This substantially reduces residual nocturnal cortisol levels, allowing for deeper sleep.
But even if someone perfectly executes all these rituals, uses the Eisenhower matrix, maps their biological prime time, and optimizes their sleep, there is a massive trap waiting for high achievers at the end of this road. And we have to talk about it seriously. The pathology of toxic productivity.
It is the dark side of optimization. Toxic productivity occurs when the pursuit of efficiency transcends professional utility and becomes an absolute identity constraint.
It's when being busy becomes your entire personality, and your worth as a human is tied to your output.
Exactly. And the physiological result is terrifying. The individual's nervous system literally becomes conditioned to perceive stillness, silence, or rest as an existential threat. This induces a pathological compulsion to work continuously, destroying physical and mental health. High performers are exceptionally vulnerable to this.
Why is that?
They often use workaholism as a defense mechanism to avoid emotional introspection, to mask deep insecurities, or to endlessly seek external validation.
And the really insidious thing about this addiction is that society cheers you on while you're destroying yourself. If you have a substance abuse problem, people try to stage an intervention. If you have an accomplishment addiction, your boss gives you a promotion, LinkedIn calls you a visionary, and society holds you up as a role model. It goes totally unchecked.
It goes unchecked until the inevitable biological breaking point. Left to fester, toxic productivity leads directly to clinical burnout. This isn't just feeling tired, it is total energy collapse, severe depersonalization, deep cynicism, and a structural inability to maintain concentration on even basic tasks.
So how do you avoid that?
To avoid this, we must manage our energy with nuance. Excellence is not a marathon of endless grinding. It is a series of intense, highly focused sprints, bracketed by periods of absolute non-negotiable recovery. You must cultivate the emotional intelligence to recognize the physiological signs of exhaustion before the neurochemical system breaks.
So we've covered immense ground today. Let's synthesize this journey. True productivity, the kind that lasts a lifetime and actually fulfills you, is not a test of your willpower. You do not manage your time, you manage your neurobiology.
Absolutely.
It requires respecting the fact that you are a lion or a wolf or a bear and feeding your brain the right metabolic fuel to avoid the crash. It means fiercely protecting your attention from shallow interruptions to build actual neurological expertise through myelination. It demands that you use systems like GTD and OKRs to filter the noise and aim high. But most importantly, it requires the humility to understand that you are a biological organism. You are not a machine.
That is the ultimate takeaway. The highly effective individual operates at the intersection of psychology and biology. They build methodological exoskeletons to protect their attention. They use rituals to compartmentalize their anxiety, but they never forget that the system requires maintenance.
And that leads us to a final thought I want to leave you with. Something to mull over as you go about the rest of your day or as you try to shut down for the night. If our brains biologically require the default mode network to generate our absolute best, most innovative ideas, and our physical bodies require deep, restorative sleep to actually execute those ideas in the real world, then perhaps the ultimate, most advanced productivity hack isn't learning how to cram more work into your calendar.
Perhaps the ultimate hack is cultivating the courage to fiercely, unapologetically, and strategically do absolutely nothing at all.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material here on the MindWire Podcast YouTube channel. Take care of your brains, protect your rest, and we will see you next time.